Well, good evening, everybody. I am Jacob Winograd here in the LCI green room where we have open and unscripted conversations. I am the host of the Biblical Anarchy podcast as well, and this will probably also be later put on that audio feed. But I'm very excited tonight to be joined by our guest, someone who I've only met once. Actually, we met at Heiss's wedding. I
Mike's
think
wedding.
the
Yep.
one, yeah, that the time that we met. But Aaron is someone who's been around. He's been a member of the Mises Caucus for a long time and on the board of directors, and he's of course the face and host of their main podcast over there, Decentralized Revolution, who they've had Doug Stewart, our CEO, on I think once or twice, so we should all hopefully be pretty familiar with each other. But yeah, Aaron, how are you doing tonight? And thanks for being here.
I'm good. It's a pleasure to be on. I know our paths haven't crossed in person much, but I hear only good things about you, and I know Doug and I think Carrie and everybody else over there at LCI. You guys do great work, and yeah, it's really nice to be on.
Yeah, of course. I've of course had Heiss on the show as well back when he was still the chair. And although here in this function, I can't make any political endorsements of candidates or parties or PACs or anything like that. People who know me know that I've been active in the Libertarian Party for a while, and I did that primarily in the sphere and coalitioning with the Mises Caucus, and I served as a state organizer for many years as well, though I stepped down from that recently because about to have my fifth kid, and I was like, I need a need a little bit of a break to focus on that and on other things that I just feel called to pursue. But I have always been a fan of the Mises Caucus in terms of the mission that you guys put out there, the platform and principles that you guys focus on. I do want to, at the beginning here, of course, before we get into talking about the caucus and how you are now, after Heiss has stepped down, the new chair of the caucus. So there's a lot to talk about, and I'm excited to get into it. But for the audience who is unfamiliar with you, go ahead and just take a minute or two just to introduce yourself a little bit, explain a little bit about your background, and then what it is that you do with the caucus and the podcast and all that.
Yeah, so I'll give my quick libertarian origin story really quickly. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio in the 80s, late 70s and 80s. And my dad was kind of what you would call like a Reagan Democrat. So I found young people don't know what that is, but that's people who came from like traditionally, Southern and or blue collar families who historically had voted Democrat, which my family is both that, Southern and blue collar. But Reagan, the sort of the cultural conservatism and the free market message kind of won them over during the inflation years of Carter and all that. So I grew up as kind of a Reagan kid. I was a weird kid who watched the news. Like as an 8-year-old, I watched like, world news with Peter Jennings every night at 6:00, and always was interested in politics and really liked sort of the libertarian rhetoric that came out of Reagan and that style of conservatism. Around age 17, so I started listening to Rush Limbaugh when he came on the air. And back then he was a lot more libertarian. Like he was never fully libertarian, but he had on a guest host every once in a while by the name of Walter Williams, who, if you don't know Walter Williams, he died within the last couple of years. He was an economist. I don't think he would have considered himself an Austrian. I think more of a Chicago school classical economics guy, taught at George Mason for the last 20, 30 years of his life. But he would guest host for Rush, and he was, a super hardcore libertarian politically, and just had a great sense of humor. And he mentioned a thing called laissez-faire books. So this is way before the internet. And back then, to find out, new things to read, you would have to go to the library or look in the newspaper, or in this case, hear about it on the radio. So I sent off for this catalog called laissez-faire books. And through that, I discovered Rothbard, read For a New Liberty, was pretty instantly converted. That would have been around age 17. into an ANCAP. I kind of wandered away from that a little bit and wasn't as interested in politics maybe in my early 20s. But around 2010, was just kind of bored and got interested in politics a little more. I'd kind of been a little re-energized by the Ron Paul thing in 2008, but wasn't like super involved. And I got involved with the Libertarian Party in Ohio, and within a few months, I ended up being the Central Committee chairman there. Was that from about 2011 to 2016? I think that's in the bio I gave you, and I think I'm right on those dates. If I'm off a little bit, and somebody wants to correct me, I'm not going to hold to that. My memory's not what it was. And then again, I was kind of not interested in politics for a while. I got married at the age of 40 in 2016, and was kind of a Mises Institute guy. Would read some of their stuff occasionally. Started reading Mises again, and then that's when the whole thing with like Charlottesville popped off, and a former chair of the LNC, to who shall remain nameless. I won't let his name be mentioned on my podcast, so you could say it on yours, but I'm not going to say it. But he went on Twitter, was like, "Hey, the Mises Institute is the preferred think tank of actual Nazis." And I was like, I don't like that. And so somehow, through Facebook, being friends with a lot of libertarians, I ended up friends with Mike Heiss, and kind of started following what was going on with the Mises Caucus. And I think I had heard some of the, at the very beginning, it's like, oh, these guys are like racist libertarians or something. I'm like, probably not. Let me look into this. And then I found like, oh, okay, no, they're cool. And so I just got involved, and that was in about 2019, I think, when I came on the board. Actually, it was maybe early 2019, maybe even a little earlier, because I know I didn't go to the 2018 Libertarian Convention in New Orleans, but I got involved fairly soon after that. So anyway, so since then, I've just been pretty involved. I've been on the board. I send out our emails. I do our podcast. And a few months ago, Mike decided to step down to work with the Rectenwald campaign and to do a couple of other things that you can't do if you're on a PAC board. You can't do certain other political things because of Federal Election Commission guidelines and all that. So I was, for different reasons, I didn't want necessarily to be chair, but I was happy to do it when the others asked me to do it. And being on the board both before and after Mike was chair, like, we work really well together. For a libertarian organization, it is remarkably drama free at the board level. Like, we all get along. There's no backstabbing. There's no petty whatever that you see a lot of times in libertarian circles. And so that's why I've stayed around a long time. Just high character people who are working toward a good goal that I share. And so I've really enjoyed it, and I'm happy to be chair and help out any way I can.
Yeah, and I've been friends with Heiss for a while. I met Mike through my friend Luke, who's also on the board, and Luke lives close to me, so that's how I found out about you guys. I became a libertarian, and we would have these like local meetups and stuff, and I'd hear about the Mises Caucus over and over again, and then finally it was like 2019. Luke and Mike. Mostly Luke, convinced me to come out to our local Pennsylvania convention, which, I would not recommend that as like by the way, a good first move to say, hey, you should get involved in politics and come check out the Mises Caucus, because libertarian conventions can sometimes be, I don't know, it can be either chaotic and drama, or it can be the exact opposite and just a snooze fest and just kind of like mindless policy and Robert's rule and kind of like debate like that. But I remember sitting at the bar, and I probably like argued with Mike for like an hour and a half, just kind of be like, all right, tell me on this whole idea of like doing stuff in the LP, why wouldn't we do it this way? Why wouldn't we do it the Ron Paul way through the GOP? Why, I just like threw everything at him, and he had good answers for every question and
Yeah.
sort of objection that I gave. And I kind of dipped my toe in the waters then, but then when 2020 happened and the lockdowns happened, I just kind
Yeah.
of that was sort of the final straw for me. I was like, all right, I was like, I am a soldier for whatever you need me to do. Just point me in the right direction and tell me, who I
Yeah.
got to go beat up, because
Yeah.
I'm tired of, I want to be able to take my kids to the park,
Yeah.
right? It's like,
Yeah.
the war, and luckily things have gotten a little bit, less tyrannical. But
Yeah.
yeah, I thought that, it was crazy. I mean, you brought up the sort of, oh, they're about, the Mises Institute and Mises Austrian style libertarians are racist by the he who shall not be named, ex-chairman Voldemort, what we can call him. And that was certainly something that irked me, and then even more so then when the Libertarian Party and its forward-facing members and people at Cato were either completely silent on the matter of
Yeah.
COVID and lockdowns, or were actually carrying
Yeah.
water for the COVID regime.
Yeah.
I just find that to be, I mean, I'm a Christian, so I'm told to forgive my enemies, but so I can't quite say unforgivable, but it comes pretty close to that.
Yeah. Well,
Especially people who bear the namesake of libertarian, and are, I mean,
yeah.
the party has a history. I mean, it's the party of Harry Brown and Ron Paul and
Yeah.
Rothbard and all these,
Yep.
heroic figures.
Yeah. And a little more about in my history, a couple of things that are relevant, especially in this podcast. So, grew up in a Christian home. We were Pentecostal. For those of you who know anything about that, it's Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee. The church I grew up in. Later, it kind of went independent. And so, always, my faith always sort of informed the libertarian thing of like, and it was more so of like, hey, God is should be in charge, and you don't have the right to tell other people how to live their lives. And I kind of saw very early on, I was kind of anti-authoritarian, and I kind of got like in school, I was like, okay, I see what we're doing here. This is not really about learning. So um kind of had those twin impulses of being a Christian, but also seeing kind of how the systems of the world were not necessarily what they purported to be. And so
Yeah.
kind of having that streak. And then so I skipped over my Republican phase. So I did get involved. I was a Reagan, I couldn't vote for Reagan. And let's see, the first election I could vote in was 96. And I think I voted for Dole instead of Ross Perot, even though I would have voted for Ross Perot in 92. And then but in college, which would have been the mid 90s, I was chairman of the college Republicans, and, was into that. I remember one time I got in trouble with with our group because in a meeting, I was arguing against standing armies, right? Like I was like, and this is Republicans, and some of the guys were in like the military reserves, and I'm like, no, hear me out. We don't need we don't need a standing army. So, um, and so I stayed a Republican, but again, kind of drifted in my, wasn't really involved after college in politics. I really liked Ron Paul, voted for him in the primary in '08. And then to my shame, I voted for John McCain in the general election. I think Bob Barr was the Libertarian nominee, and I really didn't like Obama. So the last Republican I ever voted for was John McCain. And then what finally broke me on the Republican Party was, I think it was 2010. Paul Ryan, who was billed by the corporate media as some kind of Randian libertarian, whatever. He was like negotiating this budget deal with the Obama administration, and there was like a shutdown, and they finally got a deal. The deal was, we're going to cut spending by 1% over the next 10 years or something. And so I was like, okay, that's it. I'm out. And so I was fully done with the Republican Party after that. I knew that what would happen to Ron Paul in 2012 would happen. I was supporting him, even though I was involved with the LP. But I was just telling everybody, I was like, look, they're just going to hose him and they're not going to let him get close. And so my main argument for, and maybe Mike said the same things to you of like, hey, the GOP thing is not going to work because it's like, it's trying to take over this huge organization that's all about patronage and staying in office and all this. So they're going to let you play, but they're not going to let you get to the higher echelons. And even if you play by the rules, they'll just change the rules, which is what they did with Ron Paul. And so I'm like, trying something else, and hoping for a shift in things politically, but really to go back to the whole idea of the remnant. We have to talk to people who are at least somewhat interested in liberty, convince them. And then the decentralization argument, to me, it's like, so the other argument, like the Justin Amash argument, is like, oh, we need to appeal to 33% of the electorate and we'll win the presidency. And then everybody will hear that we're right. And then we'll have a libertarian country. And then the world will go libertarian. Well, so that's kind of what I would call libertarian universalism, which is kind of to try to take power at the top or whatever. But to me, just practically the asymmetrical nature of decentralization, looking at the battlefield as it is. And I just see much more prospects for, moving toward a more decentralized thing to get more pockets of liberty. I think is our only, I think it's our most realistic chance of actually things moving in the right direction. Ultimately, I'm a pessimist. Like I'm a Christian, so I don't expect things in this world to, reach some point where we're all living in peace and harmony. But I'm the type that even if I'm going to lose, I'm going to go down fighting for what I think is right. So I'm under no illusions as to, okay, if we just reelect Angela and, get Dave Smith to run in 2 years or something, that the whole country is going to fall behind us. And, it's a long struggle. There's a lot of hard work. There's no cheat codes. There's no shortcuts. But to me, I'd rather do that than delude myself into thinking that, if we just argue hard enough, all these people in power are going to say, oh yeah, you're right.
Yeah, there's something to that which I agree with, and it's hard to articulate. So I think a lot of Christians that I encounter are sympathetic to, even if they're not like, they're not well-read libertarians, they're sympathetic to the idea that, yeah, we're ruled by people who are ultimately led by self-interest or worse. They're led by, almost, like satanic or evil forces and agendas, and, things that are contrary to Christ and his kingdom. But if you suggest doing anything about it, they have a very pessimistic sort of reaction to it, or almost like, well, things are just going to get worse before they get better anyway, and our job isn't to try to engage in sort of trying to make these kingdoms of man any better, and we should instead just focus inward on the church and on our communities. And I wouldn't even say that there's anything necessarily wrong with that. If your conviction is to do those things, then by all means follow go where God is leading you, is I guess what I would say.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that there is necessarily something barred. And actually, I would say there's probably supposed to be a certain number of people who, in their faith and in their pursuit of what God wants, will be led to kind of do what you're doing, what I've done too, which is to sort of go into the arena of the world, right? And this doesn't have to be politics. There are many different ways, whether it's political parties, whether it's engaging in high business, whether it's engaging in lobbying. I mean, there's so many areas where I could say that a Christian might be called to go into the world and to sort of like, walk through the valley of the shadow of death, so to speak, but to do so with a specific purpose. Now I tend to share your outlook in terms of like, do I, even if everything were to go the way of the Mises Caucus, does that mean that we're going to see in 5 to 10 years, like radical things like, uh, you know, healthcare be completely privatized, or uh, gun rights universalized, or anything like that, or that there's not going to be other losses of liberty along the way? Like now, I tend to think, I hope that there'll be some victories, but I tend to think that we're gonna be traveling through a terrain of, up and down, right? Peaks and valleys, and sometimes more valleys than peaks. But at the same time, I like the idea of like, yeah, gathering the remnant, and sort of like there needs to be a a voice within sort of the domain of the world, the domain of the kingdoms of man, that is saying what is true,
Yep.
that is trying to wake people up to what is true. I mean, you can, compare this to, I love the Matrix movie, which is like, yeah, like the goal is to wake people up, but to
Mhm.
do that, you almost have to meet them where they're at. You have to, cause a disruption in the matrix, so to speak, to get people to listen to you. And that's why I think Ron Paul. Now I missed Ron Paul because I was on the left at the time. My moment came differently. I saw the left completely turn on Bernie Sanders and basically do the same thing to Bernie that the
Mhm.
Republicans did to Ron,
Yep.
which kind of, and then people. And it's funny, I always tell people, I was never registered Republican, but I have voted for one Republican in my life, which was Hillary Clinton. Um, so
Yeah,
yeah,
she was a Goldwater girl in
yeah,
'64, right? Yeah.
yep. So yeah, it's like I and I didn't like that. Like, it left a really bad taste in my mouth. I felt like I was compromising on my principles, and then
Mhm.
when Trump won and the left just kind of went insane, I just was like, yeah, this can't be right. Like, this is not, I was like, this isn't my home. The left isn't the left anymore. Because when I was on the left, it was like I became a big lefty because, like, I remember just in my formative years. So I did speech and debate in high school, and I remember just
Mhm.
learning about all of the consequences of military interventionism,
Mhm.
and all the consequences of the war on drugs. And like, that's like the left I came from. Those were like the issues that we cared about. Was like, we need to, end all these foreign wars that are, killing all these innocent people and stuff, and end American imperialism, and stop locking up innocent people, in jail for nonviolent crimes. Like, that
Yep.
was, I had never encountered Ron Paul libertarians where I lived, and didn't know much about economics. And so, once I left the left and started looking for another political home, I found it, and
Yep.
whatnot. But yeah, I'd be curious. What do you think? Because you get this a lot. Like, why should Christians, or even should Christians, ever be in politics if, Christ's kingdom is not of this world, and if things are just going to get worse anyway, and we can't have any major victory? What what is the primary motivation and goals? Because, and we won't just get this question from uh, Christians. You'll get this from even libertarians who disagree with the Mises Caucus strategy, where they
Mhm.
say, well, if you're not playing to win, what's the point?
Yeah.
Like, it's a political party. In a political party, you need to be running candidates, and you need to be
Yep.
trying to maximize political wins and political donations. And it's just, if you're not doing that, then get out of the business of politics altogether and go
Yeah.
start another think tank or something. So what would you say to, sort of those lines of criticism?
Well, I guess there's two things there. One, sort of the practical thing that, the non-Christian uh question part of that question is the practicality of things. So over the last couple of years, I've gotten interested in football, the European kind. I hate American football. And I'm a baseball fan. Baseball is one of God's top 5 creations. Opening day is Thursday. I can't wait. The Reds are going to be good this year, so I'm happy about that. But I got involved watching Premier League football, and they have the relegation system, the different divisions. And so if we're starting, basically, we started a new political party. And if you're saying, hey, I just started this soccer team and I am going to compete for the Premier League championship, and I think I'm going to win in the next 10 years, it's not going to happen, right? Even if you have a lot of money, it's with a lot of money, you might get there quicker, but still you have a lot of guys to climb over. You have to win games to get up into the next level. And then a lot of things have to go right. So practically, we are playing the long game. We've been spinning our wheels for much of the past 50 years as the Libertarian Party. So that tells me that the thing of like trying to win, or, fooling ourselves into thinking we can win a presidency or a Senate or something, Senate seat or something like that. Again, so the Malay thing, I saw somebody in the comments, that's a separate thing, and I want to talk about that. So it's possible. So I think we need to have an organization, and we need to be ready to run people. I don't think the situation here in America has gotten bad enough for people to really listen to alternative viewpoints. They're so locked into the red versus blue thing. I think even if Dave Smith would have run this year, or a 50-year-old Ron Paul would have ran this year as a libertarian, I think the LP is going to get, and especially with RFK in the race, we're not going to get many votes this year. We're just not, because most of the people I know here in my part of East Tennessee, they're going to crawl across cut glass to vote against Joe Biden. And the people on the other side are the same way. So that's the other thing. But as far as like, why should Christians be involved? Well, if you make it your number one priority in life and place your hopes in like building some sort of God's kingdom on earth through the Libertarian Party, then I think you got your priorities misplaced. But to me, it's like, if you're involved in the world around you and you're not going to go to a monastery, you should find ways to be involved with the world around you, stand up for what's right and true, from a Christian viewpoint first. And for me, part of that is, hey, the fact that the government does all these things to all kinds of people is not cool. And so I like to stick up for ordinary people who are being hosed by inflation and all this, and taxes and the criminal justice system and war. Unfortunately for us here in this country, we're not really affected by war. But if you read what's going on in different places in the world, it's really horrible. And I don't like the fact that, the government that claims to rule over me is also doing all these things. So for me, it's just, I can't shut up about these things, and I have to criticize these horrible things that are happening. And rather than just do that, to put it into something constructive and to at least give people a good outlet for that. But again, if I'm putting that up, I'm not putting this up as my life's going to be a failure if we don't get 5% of the vote, next in 2028 or something. That's just ridiculous. So you got to take care of your own walk with God, your own family, your own church first. And if those things are in order, then to do these other things, I think, can be useful. Again, it's just working toward a society that I would rather live in, so.
Yeah. And I think there's utility in, again, having a voice that's within the political arena, because, we have different spheres are going to attract different people. And I mean, listen, I think, although pastors and those involved in church ministry should focus more on matters of the church and not, turn I'm not advocating that pastors turn their pulpit into a platform for talking about politics all the time. There's a certain, role for that from time to time, to, because there's some overlap there, I would say, where you can point out, at least, don't put your faith in politicians, and point out that, regardless of what Romans 13 says, the state does do things that are evil and contrary to God's word, and we should not, glorify that, not celebrate that, and even teach where there are Christian doctrines that relate to politics. Like there's the doctrine of the lesser magistrate, which I think maps on perfectly to the idea of decentralization and whatnot. That I know the Mises Caucus and Austrians like to what we like to talk about. But beyond that, I certainly don't think pastors and stuff should be on a like daily basis be speaking about what this politician said or what uh let's talk about like the these local tax codes or these bills that are being proposed, right? So Christians, that's not to say that there aren't roles for Christians to do that. It's just the church is probably not in most cases going to be, I think, the primary mechanism where Christians should be doing that. So
Yeah.
where else would they do that if they feel called to do so? Because I agree with what you said. I think the gist of it being that, well, if we're called to care for the least of these, if we're called to love our neighbor as ourselves, then considering the state is one of the biggest perpetrators of aggression and violence and predation against ordinary people and the impoverished. I mean, most around the world and in our own country, those who are uh the least fortunate are often in that position either directly or indirectly because of the state. Even someone who's like living off welfare, right? People might
Mhm.
not immediately think like, oh, they're choosing that, they're being lazy. It's like, well, to some extent, maybe, sure. I'm not saying they have no agency, but what about the incentives? What
Yeah.
about what about the ways in which the state, it's kind of like some people fall on hard times and then they don't have an easy way to pick themselves back up because of inflation, because of licensing, because of
Yeah.
barriers and government interference in education, and then they get stuck on welfare. And so we can't necessarily just have even uh, a lack of empathy for people in those positions. So
Yeah.
your argument basically being, if we care about that, then we should be advocating and sticking up for these people, and at least be letting people know the truth of these matters. And uh, speaking that in the political arena is going to be where there's the most eyes looking and ears listening, I think, for that message to reach the
Yeah.
most people.
And I think that the other advantage is that I think as a libertarian, there's opportunities for me to speak to other believers about, hey, your responsibility to your fellow man isn't just voting for the candidate who's going to appoint pro-life justices or something like that, right? So I think that both on the left and the right, one big thing of politics, the people who design the system, they know that, oh well, people feel an obligation to do something about what's going on in society and to do something for other people. And but we can convince them, oh, if you just vote for us, we'll take care of everything. So that a lot of people, I think, in modern America is like, oh, as long as I vote the right way and have the correct cultural opinions about things, then that is what as a Christian I should do in the public square, so to speak. And to me, like arguing and sort of explaining how the state does all these things like perverts incentives and uh, just stacks the deck against people, that is a way to show people that, hey, if you really want to help these people, you got to do more than just vote a certain way, right? And so and I struggle with that a lot, of like, in particular with like poverty and things like that, is how do you help people? The system is so screwed up that occasionally, if I have cash on me and I'm accosted on the street, I'll typically give someone $1 or something like that. And I don't think that's doing much good, um, but in the moment I do it. But I think because the system is so screwed up that even people who want to help the poor, um, I've heard stories and read things about that. It's very hard because this situation that the government kind of has created with welfare, the drug war, criminal justice stuff, we have this sort of permanent and growing underclass that I don't really, there's not many good solutions, I think. And so, and just being able to be frustrated at that and to speak out against it, whether it gets fixed, whether it does anything, but I think it gets people thinking. And if someone is thinking about things from a libertarian perspective, I think they're more likely to think about what their individual obligations toward their fellow man are, and not just think, oh, well, I'm voting the right way, that's all I need to do.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. One area where, and this is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I know Christians, will ask this too on the subject of political involvement is what dangers are there, and can you do to, I don't know, safeguard them? And have you and have the Mises Caucus? Not that the Mises Caucus is a primarily Christian thing, but just that in general, like if we're if the idea is like we're talking to Christians and saying, hey, there's a role for political action and the things that the Christian should care about, you could say the Mises Caucus is promoting those within the Libertarian Party. Politics, even in the LP, which I've witnessed firsthand, and I know you have too, is not, even though it's still a third party, it's not immune from the corruptive forces of politics, and you see a lot of things like backroom deals. You see people struggling over positions of power, scheming against one another to try to hold on to positions of power. Things done to try to, when the Mises Caucus was trying to take over, whether it was, different state affiliates or at national,
Yeah.
Certain political maneuvering that can, there were times where, and I'm just going to be, speaking, just genuinely, there were times where we were doing things and I would, not always feel 100% confident, like, is this, is this the right thing to do, or is this more of a means to justify the end thing? And
Yeah.
those calculations are tough because politics is sort of a compromising arena. And so
Yeah.
some people might think there's not a good way for the Christian to engage because you're going to be effective is almost going to have to require you to
Yeah.
sacrifice maybe, doing the right thing or maintaining your integrity and honesty. And yeah, I'll be honest, like there were times where, not that, I mean, it's like, listen, I don't want to like overstate this. It's not like anyone
Yeah.
ever twisted my arm and made me do anything. And
Yeah.
there, nothing was ever done like illegal. Like, I've never seen the Mises Caucus like unlike, unfortunately, and I won't make specific allegations, unlike, unfortunately, uh, opponents of the Mises Caucus who I have witnessed advocate for things like theft and fraud and uh, you know, uh,
Yeah.
just outright like bullying and harassment and even threats of violence. I've seen plenty of that. So it's, but at the same time, it's like we can't just justify, oh well, just like we can't, we'll tell people as libertarians, well, we don't vote for the lesser of two evils. So just because the enemies that the Mises Caucus runs into are doing bad things wouldn't justify if the Mises Caucus did some things that were,
Yeah.
not completely above board, and it's tough. So this is
Yeah.
less of a, trying to make sure the question comes across like it's a genuine question of like, how do we how would you tell a Christian who's thinking about engaging politics to navigate those spaces and weighing what's acceptable in terms of operating within these sort of like perverse
Yeah.
incentive structures that politics makes.
Yeah. And this maybe after I answer this question, this might be a good segue into like talking about the upcoming convention and the RFK thing and all that. But like, so that's one thing I was impressed about when I first got sort of interested in the Mises Caucus and then was on the board. And I went into it. So like I saw a lot of those petty things happening at the state level when I was in Ohio, because of how, libertarians are, state election law has a lot to do with things, but basically anybody can show up and at a Libertarian Party meeting and become involved and gum up the works, and or there's a lot of big fish in a little pond stuff that goes on. Somebody who they like, I call it LARPing at politics. So what is it? The live action role playing. They can't be in the U.S. Senate, so they come to their state Libertarian Party, and they just like to go to meetings and do all this stuff. And so there's a lot of people who are playing like it's Model UN or something like that. And I see those people who are more likely to engage in the backstabbing and this type of thing. And so when I got involved with the Mises Caucus, I told myself, and I was like, if I start to see any of this happening, I'm out, right? Because I got so tired of that with the party in Ohio, and I haven't seen that again from our board. And so I think the benchmark for me is if my goals and my principles are changing for expediency, then that's the line for me, right? I'm not going to say, oh yeah, well, I'm for these policies and I think this is the right thing to do, unless a candidate comes along who wants to pay me, give us money, who is not quite with us on certain important things, but down the road we can use this money for something else, or we might get ballot access. Or to me, like, I'm not willing on core principles like that. I'm not willing to like compromise. And everything I'm saying tonight, by the way, it's my personal thing. So I'm not speaking for the Mises Caucus board as a whole. But so there's that, and just so don't compromise on the core principles. And number two, just be honest with everybody. So don't tell somebody you're going to vote for them at some party election intending to not vote for them, right?
Yeah.
So like there can be deals as to, hey, can we get you to not run for this because we'd rather see this person, and if you do that, maybe we can get you another job, you can be on this committee or something. Like, to me, that sort of thing is ethical, again, as long as you're being truthful and you're not reneging on promises and things like that. So I look at it as like, treat people how you would want to be treated, be upfront about what you want, but don't compromise on essential
Yeah.
principles.
And this is true for all politics, and in my experience with the Mises Caucus, this was also true. When you're in a coalition of that many people, there's never going to be 100% agreement,
Yep.
and some people will do things that you don't agree with. But and there were plenty of times where, whether it was a national matter and everyone was, in the Facebook group or the Discord and debating over this or that, or whether it was, local state issues when I was an organizer, it's always, I guess, like, perception plays a lot into this, because I think from the outside looking in, you'll often see people make accusations towards the Mises Caucus of the variety of, like, well, this is basically just, I mean, I guess it's not the cult of Michael Heiss anymore. It'll soon be the cult of Aaron Harris,
Yeah.
or something like that, or it's the cult of Dave Smith, or whatever. And it's just mindless drones going out and doing. And I'd always be like, yeah, you clearly don't have any idea of what's going on behind the scenes, because I mean, nobody agrees with anybody half the
Yeah.
time. And I always appreciated that, was, even if there were, whether it was, again, statewide or national, decisions or strategies being employed, that I felt like, I don't know if I agree with that. I feel like we're sacrificing principles for expediency, even if I agree with the end goal. That conscientious objection, that I would make, was never like a, okay, now you're out. It was just kind of like,
Right.
okay, like, people, and I've always appreciated that. And I guess, listen, your mileage might vary. Like, the Mises Caucus isn't a monolith, so different states have different organizer teams and
Mhm.
uh, and whatnot. But at least in my experience, it's always been conversations with adults and people willing to agree to disagree.
Yep.
And I've never had someone like, I've had many arguments with many people, including, like, countless with Heiss himself, where
Yep.
we'll be arguing back and forth on Signal or text, and then he'd call me up, and we'd yell at each other for an hour, and then we walk away, and it's like, okay, it's like, you hash things out as adults, and then you move on, and you don't you don't I guess, like, the difference I see in the environment there is that uh disagree like, if anyone is deciding to make a disagreement something that they're going to take personally and that they're going to hold a grudge over, that tends to be the only times I've seen people who were in the caucus kind of like, whether they quit or they might get pushed out, is because like they're not willing to sort of like let their ego die, is what I would notice. It'd be like, I was always like, hey, listen, here are my objections. I think this is the wrong move. And if I was in the minority, then it'd be like, okay, I'm in the minority, and move
Yeah.
on to tomorrow's another day, and there's no point in living in the past. It's not about me. It's a coalition of, hundreds of people across the country.
Yeah. And again, I'm not naming any names or anything like that, but both with outside the Mises Caucus, before I was, back in my time in the Ohio Party. I live in Tennessee now, by the way. I escaped Ohio 3 years ago. So the people who kind of do the rage quits and stuff like that, almost invariably, to me, it's never over principle. Like it's usually vanity. Um, in my view, that principled people can work things out. And so I think you're right. Like speak to people like adults, give them the benefit of the doubt. And if you don't, so I'm talking about not people who may have like left the caucus or left the party or something like that. It's fine to leave over matters of principle, but the people who make the most noise and do the, hey, everybody, I'm leaving and here's why, and trying to burn things down. I can't think of an example of where that's done from a principled viewpoint. To me, it's almost always vanity, ruffled feathers, something else is going on in that person's life.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I would agree. You brought up, and I do want to talk about this, even though it pains me to, because to me it's almost a non-issue. But it
Yeah.
seems social media won't let it die. Everyone's convinced that, even though so many people have said otherwise, that at some point it's going to be like a pull the rabbit out of the hat trick, and it's be like, oh, just kidding. Robert Kennedy Jr. is actually the candidate for the Libertarian Party and the candidate that
Yeah.
the Mises Caucus is endorsing, despite the fact that, like, universally, I don't see enough consensus among just libertarian members in general.
Yeah.
And the caucus has already endorsed Michael Rechtenwald, who, by the way, if you guys
Yep.
are, anyone listening live, Rechtenwald will be on the show tomorrow. So it's
Oh, great.
it's Mises Caucus week here on the
Yeah.
Libertarian Christian Institute. But yeah, go ahead and speak to. We've brought him up a few times here, but speak to uh, just sort of like the thoughts about Robert Kennedy Jr., what he represents in terms of just
Yep.
the Overton window within politics
Yep.
right now, what challenges he's going to obviously present just logistically from a political angle, and the idea of him running in the LP, and why you are either in or not in favor of that.
Yeah. So like I've been talked to reporters of the Washington Post and the Hill who have called me and have talked about it. And like, it's funny because they don't seem to know anything about anything. And so basically the reason I think why RFK has, kind of made, noises about maybe doing this is because it would be a lot cheaper for him and a lot easier because we have ballot access in so many states, and or we're getting close to ballot access. So that's the ballot access thing is such a it's mind-bogglingly horrible. But the advantage for him would be to step into something, save a lot of time and money, and have that. Like, I don't think he would ever count on our organization or our people. To me, that move would be basically renting. It'd be Airbnb-ing the party,
Mm.
and taking the cash from it and trying to, do something else with it later. To me, doing that would just open the door then in 4 years for another independent to try to do that. Right. So I've been against, and I know some people who I love who are very good on a lot of things who slightly disagree with me and would at least entertain it. I personally never have, because to me, there's too many things that RFK does disagree with us on fundamentally, that either he, like I was talking to somebody about guns, and apparently he said, "Oh, I'm not going to do this." Well, yeah, you're saying that now. I don't know if I believe you. But so in other words, our principles, our core principles, that's our brand, and that would really tarnish our brand and confuse people.
Yes.
And when we did want to run another libertarian in 4 years, it would just complicate things. And to me, I think it really would invite more raids from other people. Um, so I've never been in favor of it. I think that you mentioned the Overton window, so I think it's great. In a perfect world, they would have let him compete for the Democratic nomination. And this is what I told the reporters that called me. It's like, hey, I would love to see him as the Democrat nominee. I want a world where it's, Rand Paul versus RFK versus uh, Dave Smith or Thomas Massey running, like I want better candidates in all the parties. Right. But it's not quite a good fit for us. And so he can do his own thing. We can work together on coalition stuff. We can work together on ballot access, both getting signatures and in changing ballot access laws. We can work together on medical freedom. He seems to me he's not very principled on foreign policy. He seems to go, depending on who's doing what, is what side he takes. I haven't looked into him on that a lot. I've just heard some bad things, but so in other words, yeah, we can work with him on things, but to rent our party out to somebody like him, I don't think would work. I don't think our people would go for it. As far as I know, he spoke at the California convention along with some other non-libertarian candidates for president. I think things like that, the dialogue, the debate is good. Raising the profile of challenger parties is good. But from my vantage point, I haven't seen or heard of him doing any sort of efforts to woo delegates or to do anything like that. So there's not been anything behind the scenes with the Mises Caucus about trying to get him to do this or that. I was approached by somebody in his campaign about things. I'm like, I'll talk to anybody about this, but I'm going to tell you the same thing tell him the same thing I just told you,
Yeah.
which is the same thing I'm telling you right now, Jacob. Like, hey, let's look for ways to work together.
Yeah.
So I think it's highly unlikely that they would even try it. And if they do, I don't see our delegates either in the Mises Caucus or in the party in general. I think it's a dead letter. So like if he was going to do this, he would have had to start the actual ground game 6 months ago to start
Right.
winning at least some delegates at the state level.
And that's
So
what I think
yeah.
some people are just really misinformed about how the inner machinations of the Libertarian Party work, because it's not like how Trump just kind of like threw his hat into the ring the last minute with the Republican Party and could do that. Like with the Libertarian Party, it's not primaries across different states. It's conventions and delegates, and it's a lot harder. Like he now I'm not sure if he'd be motivated to do this, but if he was motivated to try to like stage a long-term coup to run as a libertarian in 2028, like, well, that's possible. Like, I guess he has
Yeah.
the resources, he could start doing that. But in terms of, I don't think he would particularly like, he could spend that time building up something else in that
Yeah.
time. And so I don't worry too much about that. But definitely, like, although there would be short-term benefits for him, I just think he's starting way too,
Yep.
far behind the 8 ball to, like, even if he tried buying off delegates, I don't think and that's the thing, is like, it's like the one there's not a lot of things in the Libertarian Party these days that people across the board seem to agree on, but, other than, like I said, there's a few people here and there I know who are kinda open to it, but it seems to me the consensus among Mises Caucus libertarians and non-Mises Caucus libertarians is kind of like, no, like, there's no way, there's no dollar amount high enough to,
Yep.
entice people to want to, yeah, rent out the party for for yeah. I think that, in the argument you gave is the exact one I've given, which is the harm, like, whatever short-term benefits he would bring, like, sure, ballot access, money, maybe short-term spikes in membership, whatever. But, like, all that would be offset by the long-term harm to the brand he would do. Like, I mean, if the Mises Caucus was sort of like, hey, we should never run candidates, like, remember that debate Dave did at the Soho Forum, like, we should never again nominate candidates like Gary Johnson and Bill Weld.
Yep.
Like, yeah, well, like, at least Gary Johnson was a libertarian, and at least Bill Weld was LARPing as one.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
RF
Well,
and they were bad for the brand. Like, RFK would be so much worse for the brand that it's not even calculable. Like, it would take generations to undo that damage.
yeah, I think Gary Johnson did a pretty good job in 2012, although never did like Jim Gray, his running mate. Just really, you know, um, really brain dead takes from that guy even back then. Uh, but I was not embarrassed by Gary Johnson in 2012, but in 2016, oh yeah, bake the cake. Hillary Clinton's great. Like, stuff like that. It's like, I don't want people who know I'm a libertarian to think that's what I am, right?
And by the way, like the worst thing that, like, people like you could hear is that, like, that moment of them kind of, like, softly endorsing Hillary Clinton is partly what pushed me to vote for her, was because I actually, as a disgruntled Bernie Sanders guy, was looking at the libertarian candidates going, like, I really
Oh,
don't
wow.
like Hillary Clinton. Like, it just, she seems evil. Like, she seems corrupt. Like, she seems like not represented. Like, I kind of viewed her back then as, like, she seems way closer to George Bush than she does, a true, someone who's championing, true liberal or leftist values, like, as I espoused at the time. But then, like, looking at the libertarians and hearing them go, "Oh yeah, Hillary Clinton's good," I was like, "Oh well, okay. I mean, if they're saying it, then, like,
Yeah.
whatever. Like, I guess she can't be that bad, right?" And of course, I came to regret that. But yeah, like, I don't. I wonder how many people that affected, because I don't think I'm the only one. I mean, there's a lot of former Bernie Sanders people like me who ended up becoming libertarian, and I wonder, maybe we would have converted sooner and
Yeah.
more people would have voted for Gary if they hadn't done that.
Maybe.
They really screwed the pooch on that one.
And I know that was, I think, during a CNN town hall, which, again, just saying those words just makes me laugh out loud. CNN town hall, that used to be like an important thing. But that was, I remember the Ohio Libertarian Party, we got together, we had like a little watch party. And to me, it was just like a slap in the face. All these people who are, we had real problems we had to do this crazy thing to get Gary on the ballot in Ohio that year because I sued John Kasich in federal court. My name was on the lawsuit. They did some ballot access shenanigans, and the Secretary of State kicked people off the ballot in like 2014. And so all this time we had all these people, we had a lawsuit. Because we didn't have ballot access, we had to put another person's name on a presidential petition, get the signatures, and then after the convention, swap out Gary Johnson to put him on the ballot. So I was always, on Ohio Public Radio and talking to all the newspapers in Ohio about all this, and our people were working hard. And then, a couple of months later, we all do this party, and here these guys are basically telling people to vote for Hillary Clinton. Right. So, like, it was just so demoralizing and compromising on like the, bake the gay Nazi cake or whatever. Like, it was just like, what are we doing here? So I'm glad that I don't think, well, I don't know. I guess we actually somewhat are in danger of getting something like that now. If I guess Chase Oliver, the one guy,
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the current slew of candidates. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah, let's do that.
so I only got involved in the LP back in 2019. The so I don't have a whole lot. I have 2020 and this year to sort of evaluate. It feels like we have a very bloated number of people running, although it seems to have kind of whittled down in terms of. I mean, if if the straw polls at all these state conventions and the debate results and fundraising abilities seem to be indicative of anything, it kind of seems like Rechtenwald, Chase Oliver, and Mike Termat are, and then I guess like Lars is probably up there, although I kind of put him below those three, but he does have a lot of money at his disposal too.
Yeah,
So those three or four seem to be the top contenders. I do like Josh Smith personally, and I do like his campaign and platform. But I am a little skeptical that I just don't think he's, I think he's fighting an uphill battle against those three or four just from a logistical standpoint. So
yeah,
those three seem to be, and of those top three and four I mentioned, I mean, I'm definitely much more uh, ideologically aligned with Rechtenwald.
yep,
I like Termat as a person, and I think he's good on some things, but he's been lukewarm to bad often enough on things like foreign policy and a couple other things to kind of
yeah.
I'm not really sure about that. And then obviously, yeah, like if Charles, well, I just combined Chase and Lars.
You might as well. You might
I
as
might as well,
well.
yeah. If Chase or Lars got the nomination, that to me would be, if we're evaluating this from a Mises Caucus, Austrian libertarian perspective, those would be the worst two options. As you said, they'd be close to Gary Johnson, Bill Weld 2.0. So
Yep.
what's it, what went into, because after, I think everyone knows, Dave Smith decided not to run. That was
Really?
sort of where people were hoping he was going to be the Mises Caucus candidate, so that's old news. We won't rehash that story. But after that, what went into vetting different candidates and deciding on Rechtenwald? What do you think of his chances of securing the nomination come here? I guess it's what the convention's like the third or fourth week of May in DC, so close to
Yep.
me actually. What do you think of the candidates? What do you think of Rechtenwald's chances? Why is he the person carrying
Yep.
the Mises Caucus brand and
Yep.
vision for the LP versus the other ones?
Well, the reason he's the one carrying the banners because he's the only one who was willing to pick it up. So as you know, Dave said he was going to run. The torch was literally passed from Ron Paul to him at Reno. Dave decided not to run. So again, I'm not going to rehash that, but that was it. After that, we were in limbo for a long time. We didn't know what his intentions were. And so we were kind of like, okay, who's going to step up and run? And all the people who were running at that point, quite frankly, they just don't have the resume and or the skills to represent the party well in a situation like this. We approached a lot of people whose names that your listeners will know. A lot of people who could also have done a really good job. None of those people were in the least bit interested in doing it, running as a libertarian for president. And to be part of me is like, yeah, to be honest, why would you do it? Like unless you really, really care about liberty and are willing to go to some personal expense and time and quite frankly, money to do it, at least in the beginning, before there's a fundraising thing that gets going. I think that it would have taken some hard work to do it. And but people just simply some pretty I tell you what, I was very, very disillusioned by some of the feedback we got and and things like that, of people having a chance to really carry the torch and say the things that they already say, and to do it in a platform that they would not have, not quite had before, and nobody wanted to pick it up. Um, when Mike talked to Michael Rechtenwald, he was he was like, "Really? You want me to do it? Like, I'm flattered. Like, why don't you have all these other people do it?" And it's like, well, we asked him and him and him and him and him, and they didn't do it. So Dr. Rechtenwald stepped up, and like I say, so he's carrying the banner because none of the other people at the top of our movement would do so. Um, I think he's done a great job. He's got a great resume. The big knock on him is that he's not like a charismatic speaker or whatever. To me, like, I like listening to smart guys talk about things, and so I find him very engaging. But I'm 48 years old, and I don't have a small attention span, so I love him. So, but I guess I kind of get that. I mean, he's not Dave Smith. He's not got comic timing and all of that. So, but if you look at the stuff he's written, his ability to explain things, like, you mentioned what's his name? Mike Termat.
Traumat.
I think
Yeah.
yeah, so like right after like the whole Gaza thing, like he comes out with the most, as far as I remember, a very unlibertarian take on that. And from the jump, Rechtenwald was like, "Hey, non-intervention. We can't get
And then
involved. We
Rechtenwald
shouldn't be
suffered
involved."
personal consequences for that position and then stayed the course. Like
Yeah,
he didn't backpedal, he didn't try to couch it or anything. He took it on the chin, and I know he
yeah,
suffered a lot of personal cost for that, which it makes me very not just sympathetic towards him. I'm very I'm inspired
yeah,
by that courage, and although yeah, I think it's a fair criticism to say he's not the the strongest in terms of his oratory ability compared to maybe the setting the bar high with some other people that I guess were the, the people that people were hoping would step up and run.
yeah,
I think he's grown into that role a little bit better. I got to watch him here in Pennsylvania at the PA debate. I thought he performed more or less pretty strongly. uh, I do wonder, one thing I'd be curious to ask you about, since we're both Christians. I've been a little, because you'll hear do these different debates and stuff, and sometimes people bring up the question of like, hey, what's your faith? Are you a Christian? Does your, you know, how does that play into your advocacy, or and your decision to run and campaigning and things like that? And I haven't heard many. I know Rechtenwald's a Christian, and I know Chase says he's a Christian. I know Termat's a Christian, but it seems like everyone's kind of like, oh, well, I'm Christian, but that has nothing to do with this. Which I kind of was like, well, I mean, I'm not saying you should run on a Christian platform, obviously,
right,
because that's not the point. But couldn't you speak a little bit more to, like,
yeah,
kind of like how you and I kind of started out here, like, oh,
yeah,
like, yeah, because we're Christians, we care about these things, and that motivates us to be. So I've been a little, as a, again, all disclaimers, like not from the LCI position of I'm going to endorse someone, but from a,
yeah,
I'm a citizen who could vote for these people in the as a delegate, or as a, if they're on my ticket come November, that I could vote for. And those answers aren't super inspiring. I've actually, the one who's done the best job on that front has been Josh Smith, frankly. In fact, he's been quite brilliantly capturing the Christ is King rhetoric that's been going around after all the stuff with Candace Owens and Daily Wire, and doing that, which I really like that part of his campaign. I wish I'd see a little. I'm not saying they should run a overtly Christian
yeah,
platform, but I don't know. There's something to me about like shying away from your faith when you're asked about it just doesn't quite strike to me Like if I was going to give other than his oratory ability, if there's one criticism I was going to give Rechtenwald, which I'm actually planning on talking to him about this tomorrow. But yeah, I'm just curious your thoughts there in terms of like if you're running a campaign, like, and you are a
Yeah.
Christian, how would you advise uh someone, or specifically Rechtenwald, to sort of parse that out?
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't couch it necessarily in advice, but I would like to, and I had him on my podcast two or three times, and we talked a little bit about it. It's my understanding, I think he's converted recently, that so he used to be a Marxist and an atheist, and now he's a Misesian and I believe a Roman Catholic. So like and that's all happened within the last 7-10 years of his life, I think. So there's obviously been a lot of changes in his thinking. And so I will tune in and listen to hear you ask him about that. But to me, I would think that, if one is a Christian, to me, and the older I've gotten, and I think the stronger my Christian walk has become, the more I've been able to be like, yeah, I mean, it should, and I try to make it inform everything I do. That doesn't mean I'm gonna, you know, take this opportunity to ask everyone if they know Jesus Christ is their Lord and
Right,
Savior,
right.
or do an altar call in the middle of a debate or something like that.
No,
But
absolutely, yeah.
like to say, yeah, it's important, just like what we were talking about. And you don't have to agree with me, and you don't have to be a Christian to agree with me on these things, or for us to work together on something. So I don't know. That's I think a cultural thing, Jacob. Like people, like I'm Gen X, so like the baby boomer generation, it was like you don't talk about religion and politics at all. Like it's
That might
rude
be
to
part of
ask
it, yeah.
somebody. So I think there's a little bit of that, of like some of that is lingering. And I think one of the advantages of kind of our cultural just chaos, it's not anarchy, it's chaos, um, that's going on, is I think people are more, I think the church should be more bold and be like, hey, if these people are going to be espousing all these weird ideas in the public square, that's the least I can do to say, hey, Jesus is my king, and I'm doing what I think he wants me to do, and it does inform everything uh, that I do in life. So I would like for you to ask him about that. But again, maybe there's something with different people about, hey, I'm talking to a bunch of libertarians, which means there's everything from like, anarchists, Christian anarchist goat farmers, to whatever else on the,
Yeah.
there's the people who were literally casting spells on us in Reno and trying to grab Angela's
Oh,
hair
I
in
know.
the
Oh, it's
elevator so they could. So there's a wide range of who you're trying to appeal to in a libertarian debate.
yeah, it's funny. Anytime my pastor or people in my church ask me, be like, so like, what are the libertarians doing at any point over the last few years? I'm like, man, I really don't want to talk about this right now. Can
Yeah,
we? It's like, things are actually a little bit better now, although there's still some drama. But yeah, like 2 years ago, I was like, let's not talk. Let's change the subject.
right.
There's some crazy stuff
Well,
going on.
and quite frankly, I think that looking at like Chase Oliver, like I think I wish I didn't come to campaign, and that's not really my thing. But like, if look into some of the things he said about the trans kid stuff, like that's kind of like, that's not, to me, like I think any adult with basic knowledge of like human development and ethics has to look very askance at some of these things, and the standard sort of like, LP 2015 position of like, oh, we don't want to get in between healthcare providers and their patients. It's like, yeah, that's not really what's going on with hormone blockers and stuff like that. So I want an LP representative, you know, as our nominee, who's going to
Yeah.
be like, no, that's not cool. Like it's not, yeah. Um,
So we
yeah,
as we mentioned at the beginning, you and I haven't crossed paths too much. So I'm I maybe could have asked this earlier, but it occurs to me to ask it now. Are you seem to be more on the, anarchist side of the, libertarian spectrum, um,
Yep.
which obviously by the name of my show, people would know I'm on the the anarchist side as well.
Yep.
Which sometimes, that'll confuse people, be like, well, how can you be an anarchist and involved in politics? And,
Right.
I think, and then that'll touch on different issues, because it would seem like, I think Christians, when they hear that you're a libertarian or you're an anarchist, they'll be concerned about the things you just brought up, right? They're going to
Yeah.
be like, oh, well, because, like, listen, we have great answers as libertarians, and, from the tradition of anarcho-capitalism, for who will build the roads, for who will even, how we can administer private defense. I love Hoppe. I think he's one of the best libertarian writers out there who's ever handled the private production of defense, as
Yep.
well as, and Rothbard and Hoppe and David Friedman have done a great job on private law and private arbitration and all that. But then people are like, all right, well, what about right now? Like, if you're saying the state doesn't have a moral right to do anything and shouldn't exist, then, like, what about issues like transing the kids? And what
Yep.
about, and they'll hear libertarians of the persuasion of, like, Chase Oliver say, "Oh, well, the government has no business interfering here. Whatever, these decisions should be left completely up to, just a private decision between the parents and the doctors."
Yep.
And that does, you're saying you're obviously against that. I'm obviously against that. But some people will be like, well, isn't that a contradiction of your libertarian or anarchist, principles?
Yep.
I think that there are good answers for how it's not. I think decentralization has a lot to do with it, but go ahead
Yep.
and, lay out kind of how you would parse out
I,
that subject.
I love this question because people are saying, what about, protecting kids from, the trans Maoists and, or the drugs or something like that. I'm like, well, you have the state now, and it's happening now with the help of the state, right? Like, it is because we have government schools that only hire teachers who came out of degree granting institutions, which were taken over by the Marxists over the last 40 years. And all of this stuff, and the medical field, that, the academia went first, and now the government is sending people to public schools. They're being inculcated with this stuff, and the state in many is encouraging and even subsidizing all kinds of horrible stuff. And so the state, to me, is like adding gasoline to the fire of these, harmful things that a lot of Christians are rightly concerned about, right? So my thing, it's the same way with immigration, right? It's like, well, the system, this current situation is as bad as it is because of the state, right? So if the state stops acting and trying to put its thumb on the scales and push people to do a certain thing, like if we just stop spending money on this stuff and stop propping up an education system that encourages and allows all this stuff, then a lot of that stuff is not going to be as bad, right? So like so that's my first argument, is like, oh, you're saying we need a state to prevent all these things that the state is doing right now. So it's just like, oh, so you think you can elect new people who are going to reverse all that? Well, again, where is your evidence that that's ever happened, right? So
Yeah.
so my number one answer to that is, the things you think are bad, the state is either enabling through regulation or subsidizing directly.
Yeah.
And at the bottom of it all is the Federal Reserve. So like, if we got rid of those
Yes.
things, let's get rid of, like, I remember several years ago, maybe 15 or 20 years ago, I remember reading like an article by like Michael Moore or something about, he wanted to ban corn syrup, right? So like, corn syrup is bad for you, which it is, like, it's not good. But like, it's like, for me, it's like, oh, let's just stop subsidizing it, right? Let's
Yeah.
stop that. And let's stop with all the other federal control of the food supply. And let's see if people are still choosing to drink corn syrup. And then let's have this debate again. So same thing
It,
with all these things.
it doesn't it always boil back down to economics, and and the incentives and perverse incentives that the state creates when it does anything. It's
Yep.
like sometimes I get a little bit like, listen, I love the Mises Institute. I love all the work that they've done. I love Jeff Deist. I love Tom Woods. I love Bob Murphy. So many guys over there that do great work. A lot of them are libertarians. A lot of them aren't, though. And there's some Mises Institute guys who are very critical of libertarians, who used to be libertarians and aren't anymore.
Yeah.
And I always find that just kind of puzzling. Like, how can you understand Austrian economics and not be a libertarian? Because, like, if you understand how the Federal Reserve creates these, perverse incentive structures through the printing of money and the changing of interest rates and all this, and uh, which causes malinvestments, which causes, you know, spending on things and picking winners and losers, and all of this creates these distortions, right? And then these bubbles and these crashes. It's like, well, that's also true of what you just laid out in terms of like the choices that people are making, not just in what people usually associate with the economy when it comes to like lending and investing and things like in purchasing, but also like, yeah, like, things that where economic incentives touch culture when it comes to things like medicine and food. And so like, things like health freedom, food freedom, and then yes, even things like uh this sort of like these perverse things that the pharmaceutical companies are trying to do with children under the guise of compassion through this sort of like, you know, uh, gender affirming care, Trojan horse is just, it's like, yeah, exactly. That's a result of the state influence in the health industry and
Yep.
in the economy and in education and creating all this high preference behavior and
Yep.
and perverse incentives. So it's like, how can you think that the state's the solution when it's the source of the problem? When I had Dave Smith on a few weeks ago, back during the whole like 29th annual libertarians debate over borders debacle, I said, listen, I'm very sympathetic to the fact that open borders is not really the correct libertarian position because it's obviously abolished government borders entirely, and we need private property borders. And listen, yeah, open borders, especially right now, while the government seems to be very much intentionally trying to, uh, you know, funnel massive amounts of people in, not for humanitarian reasons, but for political reasons. And it's like, I know some people get a little bit upset at that statement, but it's like this is just something that states have done, like
Yeah.
Russia and Soviet Union and Russia have done this, right? I mean, and so it doesn't mean, and you can acknowledge that and still say we need open borders, but like you can't just say it doesn't happen. Like it does happen. But similarly, what I said to Dave was, okay, yeah, but like, and I feel like you would agree, and I think Dave agreed. It was like, the solution isn't really the federal government, though, because, like, if they have the incentive to do this, then going to them and saying, "Okay, we're gonna ask you to stop doing it," well, they're that's not in their incentive to do so. It doesn't matter how much we try to organize to get them to act against their interests, they're gonna act in the interests of their power and in their agendas. Rather,
Yep.
the solution should be, and this is where, the idea of the decentralized revolution that the Mises Caucus is all about comes into play, is like, instead of trying to solve these problems at the federal level, why don't we start tackling them at the state level or the local level? And I think that applies to things like the border, and I think it applies to the concerns that people have about these, you know, correct and justified concerns about what doctors are doing and pharmaceutical companies are doing. Like, don't look to Washington D.C. to pass a law to do
Yeah.
that. Like, go to your state legislator, go to your local legislator, and be like, we're not gonna allow doctors to do these things because it's child abuse. I mean,
Yep.
it's not the perfect solution, but that's a more easily obtainable, short term victory on the road to a getting government out of healthcare entirely.
Yeah. And I think that with the decentralization, the whole decentralization, nullification, secession type stuff that we really believe in with the Mises Caucus, that's, a key plank of what we do. We support, we recruit, train, support, contribute to local candidates who do believe in nullification and things like that of, state or federal law. And we're about the issues coalitions like Defend the Guard. If you don't know about Defend the Guard, Google Defend the Guard. It's a great way to get at the state's power, both domestically and foreign policy. So the reason we do that is because I'd rather live in a world where um, there are more than one. Like if the United States were a unitary state and there was one policy for 350 million people or whatever, you can't really escape from that. But yeah, okay, let's see if Texas wants to do their border different from California. Let's see what happens. And then each local, they would bear the cost. Like if California wants to have the type of immigration they want and the welfare system they have, go right at it. Let's see how it works out. Now, do I think Texas, whatever their policy would be, would solve things? No. But again, I would rather have that experimentation and have people have the option. So like, again, my wife and I moved here from Ohio, and we're no longer paying 6% income tax to the state and the city of Dayton. And things are a lot better here in Tennessee with a lot of things. And so I want those options, and I want more of those options. Like Hoppes, I think he's got a line about he wishes Europe were 10,000 Liechtensteins or something like that.
Yep.
So you might have a Catholic thing over here, and a gay atheist thing over here, and a traditionalist whatever over here, and that's great. So people can move back and forth, and so that again, like, it gets back to the libertarian universalist versus the libertarian decentralist thing. And the universalists, I think, fall into the trap of like, oh, well, if we want zero state or a very small government, then one is close to zero, right? Well, that's not what we want. We want as many small self-governing units as possible, all the way down to the individual. So therefore, 200 nations in the world is better than 50, and 2,000 is better than 200, and all of that. So just practically,
Yeah.
I don't see the universalist argument at all.
Yeah. As we're coming to the end of the time here, there was a couple questions that I wanted to get to. This will be more just kind of rapid fire here as we wrap up. But I've enjoyed our conversation so far. It's been a lot of fun. Covered a
Yeah.
wide array of different topics.
Yep.
But the Mises Caucus and PAC. You guys obviously, there's a lot of nuts and bolts where it's training up and funding candidates. Since the Mises Caucus has been around, and if you don't have exact figures, if you just want to give rough ones, that's fine. But how many candidates would you say you guys have endorsed, and funded over that time, and then how many have won? Even if you don't know from the entire time, maybe if you want to focus on like the last year or two. I know you guys had Project Decentralized Revolution with a big push this past year.
Yep.
Actually, LCI was at a couple of those events, to including the one in New York where you had Dave Smith and Tom Woods and whatnot. That was a lot of fun. But yeah,
Yep.
I just thought people might be curious to hear those numbers.
Yeah. So you asked me at the very end of a long day, and my brain is kind of fried. So if I get this wrong, I apologize, but I think we gave money to about 15 candidates in 2023, and we had, I think, 4 win, including Aaron Lamb, LAM, in town in Colorado, who he's already doing some great things there. And oh man, I really apologize to our other candidates. I truly am exhausted right now. But we had, I think, 4 people win. We endorsed many more than 15, but as far as our limited economic resources, Amy Lepore was our candidate coordinator for last year. And she really focused on, okay, is your race winnable? What's the lay of the land? Is there are you just running against one person? Are you running against an incumbent? So we tried to really narrow down our focus, and we're heading in the right direction. It's very tough. Again, even at the local level, that bias of even in so-called nonpartisan races, like unseating an incumbent or somebody who's like the local big shot lawyer or something like that. You know, I used to be a newspaper reporter and covered like county politics and stuff like that. And it was very hard for challengers then to, I mean, it's really hard to break into the political game. So people like Aaron Lamb and others who have won, and we've had several others who were like very close. It's very, very tough. So it's slow going, but we're getting better each year. Because people give us money, we're able to support these candidates and do these issues coalitions. And so I'll put in a plug. I know you guys are not you guys are nonpartisan and all this. So this is me saying this, not Jacob or LCI. If you want to get involved with the Mises Caucus, go to takehumanaction.com. You can also email me at aaron@misiscaucus.com. Hit me up on Twitter, which is @libertyaaron.com. And I spell Aaron the right way, AARON, or Aaron, as I let kids call me sometimes. Hit me up there. We can get you involved. I can explain more about it. If you want to be a delegate in DC, there's still a possibility for that to happen. So let me know. If you want to help us with DC, we're trying to get hotel beds and stuff to make sure all our delegates can get there. Sorry, I'm veering off into my pitch, Jacob, but
No,
so
that's fine. And also, yeah, you kind of made brief mention to it, but you in your closing pitch and stuff to people also, because yeah, obviously candidates is a big part of what the Mises Caucus does, but there's also the issue coalitions, and I know there's been a lot of stuff with the Guard, so you can tell
yep,
people what's been done, and then also where
yep,
they can go to find out more about those kind of things if they want to be
yeah.
involved in any of that.
So I'll talk about issues coalitions. I'll get back to the upcoming convention. So Defend the Guard is trying to get passed in legislatures around the country a measure that would prevent that state's governor from releasing his troops to the federal government for overseas entanglements that are not part of a congressional declaration of war. And so just think about the implications of that. We've got it helped to get passed in several single houses of state legislatures. And, we've got to the point where like the defense contractors call in the heavy hitting lobbyists and get calls from generals and stuff like that. And so the guy, Dan McKnight and Bring Our Troops Home is the group that thought of that and are doing it. A big part of their volunteer base has come from the Mises Caucus. But Diego Rivera and Dan McKnight are heading that up, and they're awesome. We also helped with Decriminalize Denver, it's been 4 years ago now, which decriminalized psilocybin in the town. In the city of Denver, it passed literally by 8 votes or something like that. And we got involved toward the end of that and sent some volunteers and I think some money their way, and so helped with that. We're also looking at, talked to somebody recently, I think it's in Massachusetts, about a similar sort of decriminalization type thing. But we're on the lookout for issues, preferably at the local, municipal county level, possibly at a state level, to do things like do Second Amendment sanctuaries, drug legalization, Defend the Guard type stuff, freedom to farm, school choice, stuff like that. School choice, that's another debate, but we'll see. But anyway, that's what we're really looking to do. Contingent on all that. So it makes our job easier if we have a Libertarian Party that is not 2015 Libertarian Party. And to do that, we need to keep control of things at the convention coming up. It's Memorial Day weekend in DC. I think we're going to have a majority of the delegates going in. In fact, I pretty sure we are, but that's the delegates who are chosen as delegates. We have to get everybody to DC, and we have to counteract the people who you mentioned. Lars has like lots of money and he's flying people to DC. So, is what I've been told. So it's all about getting people there and getting them to the convention floor to vote, which is what we did at Reno. So if you want to be involved, if you just want to give some money to help out, all of those things, if you want to be a delegate, if you want to find out more, if you have an idea for an issue coalition where you are, we're really looking for people to come to us with some ideas to ramp that up this summer and beyond. So takehumanaction.com, Aaron at misiscaucus.com, or at Liberty Aaron on Twitter. And yeah, so I feel like I've just monopolized the conversation for the last 10 minutes, but you had me
it's
on.
good.
So yeah.
Yeah, no, that was good. I think you covered everything there. Yeah, again, it's like LCI does not make any endorsements of
Yeah.
any of this stuff, but I can say that uh, the lessons and the principles that are at play here in what everything you guys are doing are the main reason why uh, we at LCI are keen to have conversations with you guys and have you on, because everything you do in the political sphere, whether it's these issue coalitions, whether it's the candidates, and even when those things fail, they are still putting, ever so slightly, libertarian impressions on the scale of politics and the Overton window and what people are hearing, what people are talking about, and you know, uh, creating more opportunities to tell people the truth about you know what's going on in the world. I mean, as Christians, we're told that in the beginning God gave the earth and the animals, everything to us to have dominion over. Well, the state is a poor steward of everything on God's creation, whether that's people and protecting the sanctity of human life, whether it's their rights, whether it's the environment, whether it's anything pertaining to the allocation of scarce resources. The state and central planning do those in the worst possible way, and usually in the most destructive way. And so, we should, I think, as Christians, care about that and about understanding economics, about understanding how political structures work, and understanding how having more knowledge and more liberty allows us as Christians to do better the things that Christ has commanded us to do. So I think that uh, you know, if you like the things that you heard today, I would definitely encourage you on a personal level to check more of
Yep.
these things out, not just the Mises Caucus, but the Mises Institute and what they're doing, and all the names I dropped. Check out what they're doing. So yeah, you said it was takehumanaction.com is
Yep.
where people can find out more about that. And yeah, Aaron, I appreciate you having on. Any closing thoughts here before we close out?
Yeah, I actually have a question or two for you. So I'm always on the lookout for good things to read and listen to. I would highly recommend the book "The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self" by Carl Trueman. I'm about 2/3 of the way through that. It's kind of a Christian, but very scholarly, but Christian perspective on like why our culture is the way it is. And it's not like a standard, like, red, white, and blue conservative Christian type thing. It's very, very good. What are you listening to and reading that, aside from what's on LCI, just as a Christian? I'm more in the frame of mind of as a Christian, but I'll take libertarian stuff too. But personally, are any good podcasts of good teaching, stuff like that? I was asking you for Jacob's recommendations.
So the first book I'd recommend is, actually, I just interviewed this author a couple weeks ago, but so Preston Sprinkle wrote this book, Exiles: The Church in the Shadow of Empire, which I loved this book. Like the first sentence: going to church is a politically subversive act, or at least
Mm-hmm.
it used to be. I mean, like, if that's not a hook, I don't know what is. Preston's definitely, he's leaning more libertarian these days because he's in but his work is scholarly and theological work is very much calling Christians to kind of have a more, what I would say is a essentially a libertarian mindset in terms of how we uh, the role that the church should play, and understanding the role that the state plays in terms of um, in the, well, as it says, we don't struggle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and the forces in heavenly places and things like that. And so the state, falls more into that latter category than in anything in terms of good or virtue. And so that's a book I would highly recommend from a Christian angle. I've also the other book I have here that I've actually already finished this. This is Engaging the World with Abraham Kuyper. I come from more of the Reformed persuasion, and I find a lot of Abraham Kuyper is kind of the founder of like Dutch Reformed, Dutch Calvinist, theology and philosophy. And although some of it kind of gets more into liberalism, but a lot of it I actually think is very compatible with libertarianism. I'll also plug Reformed Libertarians podcast, another podcast here at LCI, and that's Kerry Baldwin, as you mentioned earlier, and Greg Baus, and they've done a lot of work on this, and I've had them on my show to talk about it as well. But there's this Dutch Reformed idea of sphere sovereignty, which I think is a really interesting theological concept. Kind of plays in hand with the doctrine of the lesser magistrate, and really plays into, again, to sort of like, not that I always, I'm sure you understand what I mean. Like I never want to say, oh, we're trying to go back into the Bible and force libertarianism into it. It's like,
Yeah.
I always say, no, it's like, if anything, it's almost mind-boggling to me how much the opposite happens, where I just go and read the Bible, and I, whether it's the Old Testament and the failures of the kings, and the comparing that to the time when they lived with just judges, or whether it's listening to Jesus talk about the kingdom of God, or whether it's looking at these different historical doctrines and theologies and stuff, and including sphere sovereignty, which is really fascinating, how
Yeah.
much these biblical truths just seem to be sort of like proto libertarianism, right? It's
Yeah.
like I very much do think libertarianism is sort of an outgrowth of Christian values. It's kind of like, if it's natural law, which should match up with natural revelation should match up with special revelation,
Yep.
which is what the Bible is. And so yeah, those are two books which I think do a good job at, like, they're not overtly libertarian books, but they're Christian books that I think speak very much to the ethos that and the compatibility of those two schools of libertarianism and Christianity, which you and the people listening might very much be interested
Yeah.
in.
All right. Well, yeah, I appreciate it. And I'll, if you think of anything else, you can text me. And I have a couple other questions in that line. But I'll just, offline, I'll ask you, but, I appreciate you giving me so much time. I always feel like I talk too much. You get me wound up, and, I kind of go, I'm no Michael Heist though. I can't out talk him.
No, no. Although,
Yeah.
I mean, somehow when I think when I had Mike on, luckily he had a hard stop, but because I kept him under an hour when I had him on. But no, man. I mean, listen, you're like I said, we haven't had a chance, unfortunately, to cross paths too much. But I listened to practically every episode of Decentralized Revolution podcast, and I've always appreciated you and your work. And
Thanks.
I'm glad that we were able to have this conversation. I hope everybody listening, that you guys were able to enjoy that as well. Please make sure to tune in tomorrow. So if you haven't already, like this video, if you're wherever you're watching it, subscribe so that you get notifications for the upcoming streams and stuff. So yeah, tomorrow, the Mises Caucus endorsed candidate for Libertarian Party, that is Dr. Michael Rechtenwald, will be joining me for the second time since he announced. But a lot's happened since I had him on like early on, and since then,
Yeah.
all the stuff we talked about, like in terms of his cancellations and whatnot
Yeah.
have happened, and so I'm really interested to talk to him about that. So it's Mises Caucus week here at
All right.
LCI. So Aaron, thank you so much for coming on, man. It's been a blast. Thank you everybody for listening, and yeah, until next time, live in peace and live for